So when I began to think about writing about motherhood, the first book I wrote was one called Secret Mother's Business. My kids were very little. They were 4 and 7, and it was based on a night that I spent with a group of girlfriends. We went away, we drank a lot, we ate a lot, we were a night away from our partners and our children. And this book was really about exploring the taboos and the dark side of motherhood. And that book, quite bizarrely, went on to sell 500,000 copies in Germany, interestingly enough. So about 7 years after that, my publisher came back and said to me, well, is there another book that you might want to write about? Surely motherhood has changed. Your kids are now tweens, almost teenagers, and there certainly was more to say. So I wrote a book called The Reunion, which was about some of those women from the first book coming together again. And some of them had dropped off, some of them had new friends, and they go away now for a weekend and they talk about their lives, about motherhood, how their relationships with their children and their partners have changed, their friendships have changed. And that book did reasonably well, not as well as Secret Mother's Business, but it sold very well again in Germany. And so it struck me 7, 8 years after that, when my children were young adults, well, they are young adults right now, that there was a lot more to say, because 7 years is a long time in the story of being a mother. And I had so much to say, not only about them, which the first 2 books had largely been about, but about how when your children sort of shrug you off and step into their own lives as young adults, what that does to a person's identity. If your identity has in any way been pivoting around this role as a mother, how menopause, which completely changes your sense of yourself, of your relationship with your partner, your relationship with your body, how that gets involved too, and how it can, this time in a person's life, put a strain on even a happy marriage. So I said to my agent, well, if the Germans would like a third in the trilogy, I'm happy to write a third in the trilogy, because there's plenty to say about it. And of course, they wanted a third in the trilogy. And that is exactly why I wrote Unbecoming, which is about the same woman from the first 2 books who's now got 2 young adult children, and she is in a happy marriage, as she has been all along. This is not a book about bad marriages or abusive marriages or anything like that. It's a perfectly happy marriage that is taking a kind of ordinary strain, and she just decides she needs a sabbatical from her marriage. She just wants to figure out who she is. She's got these 2 grown adult children who are not moving out. They're still living at home. They're millennials. They've made life choices she doesn't understand or necessarily condone, even if that is a thing that parents can or should be doing in this day and age, condoning what our children do. But her children have taken their own life paths, and she definitely needs to get away and figure out who she is. So she goes away on her own, but she bumps into a woman from the first book, a mother who she knew when their kids were small, whom she hasn't seen in 15 years. And this mother has had breast cancer. She's just been widowed. And this woman says, look, I'm walking into the wild, into the Australian bush overnight to celebrate my 57th birthday with a group of friends. It's going to be in silence. It's going to be a sacred ritual. Would you like to join? And she agrees to go with this group of strangers into the bush for the night. And it's what happens over the course of that night that the story takes place around that, the conversations, the stories, the revelations, the connections that happen when a group of women go together away and spend a night under the stars. Well, motherhood is definitely one of the themes of Unbecoming, and in particular about how you remain a mother of children who don't want to be mothered anymore. What actually happens with this identity that we have spent all these years, decades, perfecting? I mean, for me, being a mother was the absolute central identity of my whole life. My whole life wanted to be a really good mother. And what happens when you get to a point where being a good mother, not being a good mother, being around, not being around, it doesn't matter anymore. You know, your kids are actually like, it's enough now. Thank you. It was great, but I'm out of here. I'm tapping out of this. So I wanted to explore what happens to us when what we have become is no longer what we need to be. And that's why the book is called, partly why it's called Unbecoming, because there's a beautiful quote by the wonderful author James Hollis, who says, at a certain point in our lives, at midlife, what we have become is now our chief obstacle. And I recognized this with myself, that everything that I had now become was now in my way. How could I get past this need to be a mother? And what was I going to do with all of this energy? So I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore the sense of emptying. Obviously, you know, the idea of the empty nest, the emotional emptying that happens because these vessels into whom you poured all this energy and time and love are now completely self-sufficient. If you're lucky, by the way, I mean, in the story, there are some mothers whose nests have not emptied and probably won't empty because their children have physical or emotional difficulties. And that is another whole story about what happens when your nest doesn't empty in the right way of things, if you're blessed enough for that to happen. So it was to also then question how emptying can be a blessing, not this narrative of, oh, woe is me, my children have left. The sense of divestiture, what you can let go of, what changes, what spaces open up. In fact, this room that I'm sitting in, this beautiful study, was my son's room. And when he moved out, I got to take the space over and turn it into this beautiful study that is my own. And I cannot tell you what a sense of self that has given me back. The wonderful American poet and writer Adrienne Rich once wrote that women need selves of their own to return to when their children grow up. And it's this sense of self that I wanted to explore, you know, who I was going to become, or who I was once my children had left me. There also, I think, comes a point, what I've called in the book, the toxic proximity of parent and child, where it just is no longer healthy when your children are right in your space and you are right in their space, and it becomes very tight. It's almost like those last few weeks of pregnancy where you just cannot imagine that you can tolerate this anymore, this growing inside of you. I feel like with children who live at home, there comes a point where everybody needs their own space. It's not just you. They absolutely need to find out who they are on their own, and they need to separate. And otherwise it can become really difficult. So I wanted to explore that, how you love them, you don't want them to leave, but you absolutely want them to get out. You just want to get them out, right? It's also about having these new relationships with our adult kids. You know, I wrote a book also about parenting teenagers, and that was about how you have to change the way you parent your children when they become teenagers. So the kind of control and the kind of authoritarian ways that we have when they're small, because we know better and they must do as they're told, this kind of parenting does not work when they are teenagers. And if you continue along that line, you are really creating problems for yourself and separate from them. You fail to connect with them. And there has to be a different way of parenting them. Certainly when they become young adults as well, you don't want to say, well, I wash my hands of you. You also don't want to completely finance their lives and emotionally support their lives. You want them to, you want to push them up against the edge where they can find their own feet. But at the same time, you want them to know, if it doesn't work out, I'm always here. But you don't want to be that, you don't want to take the role of being the rescuer or constantly checking on them or being on top of them all the time. So it was also about, you know, how you find your place in that space as well, because you definitely, having moved to the margins when they're teenagers, you now really take a back step and you let them do their own thing, and you watch them make mistakes, you watch them fail, you watch them struggle without constantly rushing in before they fall. You let them do it, and you are there as, you know, as the adult parent if they come and ask your opinion. But there's a chapter in the book where her son is doing something and her husband says, don't offer your opinion unless he asks for it. But she knows he's making a mistake and he doesn't ask her opinion. And so the hardest thing in that moment is to really then keep your silence, know that if and when he decides that, well, this was a mistake, I'll come to my mum, I can discuss it with her, and she's not going to say, well, I told you so. She'll just be there and go, well, let's see how we can work out how to fix this together, or whatever it may be. So I was trying to explore all of these different aspects of motherhood and the changes, mostly the space that it opens up when it's not the central theme of your life. Absolutely everything. The main thing that there is to celebrate is this incredible relief that I didn't die young, and that I got my children to young adulthood. My daughter's on the cusp of a prefrontal cortex. My son is still a few years away, but in my head, there was always, when that prefrontal cortex kicks in, I really can say, okay, it's up to you. It's also about learning to trust your children and know that everything that you've already done up to this point is somewhere in there. You might not be able to see it, but all the love, all the attention, every bit of parenting you have done is somewhere invisibly threaded into their being. And so while you might watch them make stupid choices and do silly things, you have to, at some point, step back and trust that you've done enough to turn these into young adults, and whatever mistakes they make and whatever successes they have, because this is the other thing, don't belong to you. Their failures are their failures. It doesn't reflect on you. Their successes are their successes. It doesn't reflect on you. They are their own people and they're on their own sovereign path. And so it's also just kind of about not feeling like you own them, or you own the rights to their lives, or you own, you know, the copyright to their souls or their personalities or their life choices or what they end up doing or not doing with their lives. They are on their own sovereign paths, but this letting go is the hardest part of it. So for me, this relief of having kind of done enough to get my children to a certain age, I was always scared I would die young and leave them before I'd finished parenting them. I think I've kind of done my parenting. And so there's this relief that if I die now, no one's going to sob, shame she died so young. They can only sob, shame she died so middle-aged. And that's a great relief to me. That's the first thing. The other thing was, up until this point, I don't think I'd ever experienced real freedom. Even when I was young and before I partnered with the man who is now my husband, and I was having relationships and, you know, doing whatever young people do at that age, it might have felt like a certain kind of sexual freedom or emotional freedom, but there was always in my mind, like, I definitely knew I wanted to have children. So like my radar was still doing this to see, you know, who am I going to have children with? Who's going to be the father? Am I going to do it on my own? Is it going to be with this man, this man? And so that's not freedom. That's not complete freedom, because you're still, you know, working within a certain parameter. Now that my body literally cannot have children anymore, and I am completely menopausal, which, by the way, is the best relief of anything in the whole world. Like when you finally are menopausal, what a relief. Thank goodness. I understand a little bit now what it's like to be a man and never have to think about what your body's doing and what time of the month it is. Such a relief. But I suddenly feel like my life is completely open. There's none of this. I'm not scanning. I'm not working out what the future is going to be. It feels completely wide open, and I feel very suggestible. Like I could do anything, I could go anywhere, I could be anyone. I'm not really beholden to anyone other than really at this stage, because this is the other thing to keep in mind about this age, elderly parents. I mean, my elderly parents are in South Africa, and with COVID, it has just been very, very difficult. My mother hasn't been well, and it's been very, very difficult. And so for me, when I start thinking about where do I belong, I recognize I don't belong with my children anymore. That's fantastic. They belong to themselves. They belong, if they're with partners or within particular careers or on their own life paths, that's where they belong. There's a question that comes up, do I belong with my husband now that we have jointly done this work together? Do we still fit together in the same way? We came together to do a job. We've done this job. How do we fit together now? So that always becomes a new conversation, a new negotiation, and many marriages fall apart at this time, which you know, people might think is really sad, but there's also something quite like an opportunity for something new to come in and take its place. It's not necessarily sad. You know, it could also be the chance to find a new kind of, a second kind of chance at a relationship which isn't burdened with child raising, children, you know, raising children, which is a huge burden on any relationship and takes a huge strain on any relationship, particularly if there are difficulties and you've had kids who've had a lot of struggle. You know, raising them has been a struggle. So I feel like there is an immense amount of freedom at this age to really decide, am I still heterosexual? Maybe am I bisexual? Am I gay? Am I going to explore new things without feeling like, well, you know, there are certain conventions I've got to follow. It just kind of feels to me to be a lot more open. I also feel like at this age, you've lived long enough. You've got perspective, enough perspective on life. Certainly all of us, if we are lucky enough to be at midlife, have lost people younger than us. We have lost friends or family members who are younger than us. And when you've lost somebody, when you've outlived someone that you have been close to, you lose a certain casualness about life. You have a certain seriousness about how precious life is, how precious time is. I feel like you don't waste time in the same way as you do when you're young. You don't have this fantasy that life goes on forever. And you're able to do an amazing maneuver, one that I'll talk about in relation to a yogic breathing technique. So when you do yoga, sometimes they get you to breathe through one nostril, hold it in, and then breathe out through the other, and then breathe in through the other nostril, and then you breathe in and out through these different nostrils, and then you can breathe in through both nostrils. And there's this amazing relief when you can breathe in through both nostrils. And I think when you're younger, you're either breathing in through like the life is terrible, or there's grief or disappointment, or you're breathing through the other nostril, which is that, oh, you know, life is fantastic. I can have whatever I want. I can be whoever I want. Life is wonderful. And when you're at this age, you can breathe in through both nostrils at the same time. You can hold grief, you can hold joy at the same time. It's like you're not doing this either or thing. There's less of this binary thinking. You can sort of hold the whole world together in that one moment. And so you can hold paradox. And I think that being able to be with life, not necessarily being attached to your opinions, because you recognize that an opinion is just such a temporary state of mind. You become less judgmental about other people and their life choices. You become more compassionate towards people, to yourself, to your body. If you are not dealing with some big disease, which many of us are at this age, diabetes or cancer or whatever it may be, if you're not yet dealing with one of those big things, you know, you are incredibly lucky. And I think at this age, you know it. Whereas when you're young and you have all of these things, you don't think to say, oh, wow, I woke up without any pain today, or, you know, my body's still working, you know, I can still go to the toilet without too much struggle. I mean, what a blessing is that? At this age, I think one knows what a blessing that is, you know. So I just feel very grateful to have a body that is relatively strong and fit. I started swimming 2 years ago after a terrible back injury. That has been life-changing for me. I also, you know, am able now to swim out quite far in a way that I think I would never have done when I had small children, because the risks I'm willing to take have changed. When I had small children, I was so risk averse. I didn't want to do anything that could imperil me or them. Of course, that's also just a kind of an illusion. It's a kind of, that's how control freaks behave. But I thought I was sort of somehow in control. Now I sort of feel like, well, this is my life, and I'm going to take the risks that I feel I can live with. And I know that if anything happens to me, as my daughter said to me, Mum, we'll be very sad, but we'll be okay. And that's remarkably freeing. That is so wonderful about this age, that midlife, is that women talk about, you know, becoming invisible. And I think that invisibility is a superpower, and people underestimate you when you are invisible, and you don't maybe get the same kind of attention that you thought you wanted when you were younger. It is attention that is quite distracting, and it is attention that is, I think we're starting to see, is not actually necessarily empowering of us as women. It's not a celebration of your intelligence. It's not a celebration of your abilities. It's a different kind of attention. And so for me, this invisibility, such as it is, because I've become much more visible to myself. So the other question is, who are you invisible to? Has also been a great revelation of midlife. I've loved becoming invisible. So the setting of this book is that these women walk out into the Australian bush, and it takes place just before those devastating bushfires at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, when we were all on the precipice of talking about how the natural world is suffering. There is this lingering sense of something, of an impending doom, of something coming to an end and what is disappearing. And as these women go out into nature, you're kind of out in naked nature. You can't make up stories about what is and is not real. If it is too hot, you really feel it. You're not in an air-conditioned environment. You're seeing what's going on. The women have conversations about how the heat of climate change is, also like the heat of menopause, this kind of anger, this kind of fury that is working through us and is burning off everything that needs to die away. So for me, the natural world becomes this canvas against which these very deep connections and conversations start to happen. And when the book begins, there are these 6 different women who come from completely different backgrounds. And as the story unfolds, we find out how they know each other and what has brought them together. And they are always life stories, and often stories of loss and stories of grief that have actually brought these women to a place where they are deeply connected to one another. And what we find as the story unfolds is how every story is threaded to another story. And I think the story of climate change has to do with the fact that we have failed to make connections between how between everything, how everything is tied to everything else. Everything we use, everything we dispose of, what we consider waste, how we interact with the natural world, all of that is part of the big story that we have lost control over because we have just consumed. So for me, there was definitely this sense of impending loss, impending grief, and impending doom, and also the sense of not being able to give up because we have an obligation to this younger generation. We have an obligation to our children. So there is a way in which I have brought this younger generation into the story, and I won't say how, just because it might just not be a real spoiler, but I definitely wanted there to be a representation of the younger generation, even as this older generation of women is walking out into the bush. Not their own children. It's not their own children. It's almost a bit like that Pied Piper story where the young have disappeared and these older women are walking out into the bush, but there has to be a voice of this younger generation asking the older generation, what happened here? Like, how did this happen on your watch? And so that's one of the other themes here, is that there are conversations about, are we going to have grandchildren? There is one of the chapters called the grandchildless generation, because I think my generation is definitely facing the prospect that our children will choose not to have grandchildren. What does that mean? And what does that mean for our lives and the meaning we make of it all? But it definitely sits there in the story as a possibility that we have raised these children and cared for them, but we didn't do the same for the earth. And so what is going to happen now? It's not a question I answer, but it's just a question that I pose in the story. An insight into what the experience of menopause feels like, certainly viscerally in our bodies, but also how menopause seems to me to sort of be a kind of an unfixing of our sense of femininity, of our sense of wifeliness, of our sense of wanting to fulfill certain roles. And what happens in that time is that I think it can make a person feel very confused. Certainly it has been confusing for me. It's been quite freeing for me. But what it does is it opens up new conversations, I think, between partners, sexually as well. You know, I think our bodies really do change. And what I say in Unbecoming is it's like, you know, if your partner's saying to you, look, I don't know how to make love to you anymore. The truth of the matter is that it's like one's sexuality sort of undergoes a personality change. And it's like, we don't know what satisfies us anymore either. So that can either become a problem or it can become a kind of an opportunity, a kind of a, well, let's see what does work, you know, what might work here. So it becomes a conversation. I hope that what this book will do for men is that it will give them an insight into the explosions and the confusions and the mysteries of midlife, but I hope it will make men more interested in women of this age rather than, you know, turn us into this incredible term that I discovered while I was writing this book, termagants, which are these like shrewish, vitriolic, mad, quarrelsome, unreasonable, unbecoming women, which I think a lot of men find women of my age just kind of too much. We're just like over the top. So I'm hoping that it might be like, oh, actually, maybe women this age are really interesting because we actually are beyond caring too much about what other people think and hopefully caring too much about, does my bum look fat in this? And rather, you know, a little bit more open to experimentation, to exploration, more curious about ourselves and our sexuality. You know, as I said, we are much more suggestible at this age. So, I mean, if one is open to suggestion, the whole world is a possibility there. And that I think is quite exciting. I do think it's an exciting age. And one, you know, when you realize that time is running out, your sense of urgency around finding joy, finding pleasure, experiencing your sensuality, your sexuality, the strength of your body, what your body still can do and enjoy without too much pain, or without needing to empty your bladder. All of these things become much more precious. And I think when you have an appreciation of that, it does make life much richer. So I would love to hear from men who've read this book and hear what they think, because I wouldn't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I would love to hear back. I know for women that it has been incredibly liberating to have a voice around this time, because there is a lot of taboo around this time of life, not a lot spoken about. It's not a very sexy time of life, but I hope I have made it a bit sexier through this book. Well, I've learned to never sort of say I will never do something, because I never thought I would ever, you know, swim in the ocean far out. So anything is possible. And I do think that there is possibly a fourth book, which might happen if I ever became a grandmother. I'm not sure that I ever will, but I imagine that that would be a very different time of life, and it would change the relationship with my children. I have no idea what it would be like to have a grandchild, and maybe even if I didn't have a grandchild, what it would be like to lose parents, because I'm very lucky that I still have both my parents, and to maybe, you know, get older and more infirm, perhaps be dealing with a chronic disease or something like that. I think there is a lot still to say. I mean, I'm in my early 50s, and so I'm sure that there are stories of in your 60s and 70s and even into your 80s. I find women of this age particularly intriguing and interesting. And if you've ever had the opportunity to chat to a woman in her 50s, 60s, and 70s, you'll know that you couldn't hope to have a more interesting conversation, one of depth, one of compassion and integrity, one of you know, a sense of balance. You know, if you ever, I think, you know, as we become older, we become elders, we get the chance to become elders, and that is a huge responsibility, and we have a lot to share. And I think that the wisdom that people have to share at this age is not obvious, and it's not in people who make a big noise and take up a lot of space, or who are in leadership positions. I think anyone who is in their 60s or 70s is in a has a lot of leadership and management skills. If you've raised a family, if you've, you know, ever juggled jobs and family and all of this kind of stuff. And so I'm very interested in the lives of ordinary people, particularly of women at this age, who perhaps have not had opportunities to have big careers, but who have big lives in other ways. You know, that like 90% of all the volunteering that is done in the world is done by women in their midlives and older women. They do all the volunteering. As soon as, you know, they're finished taking care of their families, they go on to continue to take care of the planet. So I'm particularly mad about, you know, women, older women, and would love to maybe share more of their stories in time.